So welcome everybody. So today we have visualization, which we're going to get into, and I'm excited about this one as well. My company is Full Fit Living. I work on optimizing people's health routines through nutrition and exercise and yoga, and also using all these creative tactics that Charles and I have been discussing for the last, I think, 7 weeks now, which is pretty exciting, I think. So Charles, you're on.
Yeah, so I'm Charles Leon, and designer and blogger and speaker. And this week we're talking about visualization, which is a subject that I've used a lot personally in my professional life and sometimes even in my private life. So I think if I sort of launch straight into it, just to say that visualization is actually nothing mysterious or nothing occult, or people do it all the time. Everybody does it all the time, and it's quite the only difference, I think, is that some people, that being mostly creatives and designers and lots of other sort of professions too, are actually able to use it, to enhance it, and to make it work for them. So basically, in a very, very small nutshell, visualization is basically what you do when you anticipate something. So and we'll come back to this quite a few times throughout this talk, I think, is that when you visualize something, you're making some sort of either a prediction, or you have a concern, or you have an anticipation of a future event. So visualization, if it's used well, correctly, or not necessarily correctly, but if it's used, can then enhance that and can be used for creative purposes. So what we're going to do this evening, if it works for everybody, well, it will work for everybody, I'm sure it will. I'm going to go through a small exercise that you can all do, and I'll do it in 3 parts, and we're going to break up those parts with a little bit of explanation, a few things behind it. So if you're ready, then what I'd quite like you to do is, first of all, just close your eyes, take 2 or 3 deep breaths, and that means you too, Christina, you've got to do it too. Just relax, just sit with your spine nice and straight, and then just take 3 deep breaths, and inhale on 4, and then exhale, and hold for 4, and then exhale, but just relax, just calm. Right, and then I want you to imagine that you see in front of you, through your mind's eye, a paper napkin, a folded paper napkin. Just very simple. That's either on your lap or it's on the table in front of you. I want you to be able to visualize it, to see it, to picture it, and it's on the table in front of you. Then what I'd like you to do is to, in your mind's eye, to pick it up with both hands. And just pick it up and just hold it. Now, what you have to do is you have to feel the weight of it, feel the texture of it, and bring it close to your nose and smell that papery smell, and feel that the slightly soft, slightly absorbent texture as it touches your nose. And you can also feel with your fingers that slightly embossed decorative edge that runs around the edge. And that's it. That's all I want you to do. Now, hopefully that was pretty easy. That's pretty straightforward. And what you've just done is you've just put an image of something that doesn't exist in your mind, which is a very, very, very simple first part of the exercise. What you're doing there is that you are generating an image in the first instance, then you're generating your senses. And the interesting thing, of course, is that your brain is actually firing up in exactly the same way, or not exactly the same way, in a very similar way to the actual event were actually to happen. So we'll come to how all that works, but now we're going to sort of come back to that in a minute, and then we'll go to the next stage of that exercise. But Christina, you wanted to talk about sort of what visualization is useful for.
So a couple of things, and then when Charles is talking, so we're coming at it kind of from two angles. And as he described, one with a napkin that we were just creating and visualizing something in our mind's eye. There's another couple ways that I use with my clients and my athletes as well is for achieving goals, for setting and achieving goals. And it's almost like you have a defined path or purpose or outcome that you want to achieve, and then you visualize that actually happening, and then what you need to in order to get there as well. So it's almost like a mental rehearsal. It's a visualization of winning or completing the tasks, or maybe a certain climb or a certain route that you're going to do, or a certain trick you're going to do. We do that a lot in snowboarding and skiing, where the coach will actually come on and have all of the athletes visualize certain tricks specifically and feel how they're going to feel in order to execute them before they even go out and do them. So I think that's really interesting. The couple things that Charles is going to go into a little bit more are changing mindsets and changing habits in order to achieve the behavior or the idea or the outcome that you want to have. And then also, I think, Charles, you're going to go into designing as well.
Exactly. Talk about sort of designing or creative pursuits,
Yeah.
because there's a thing that we call ideation, which is generating ideas. Now, it's not just as simplistic as just generating ideas. It is actually creating in your mind's eye, and then perhaps on paper or perhaps in a model or however that may be, particularly if you're an architect or designer, to create a future vision of something that does not exist. And that's the key skill that this is all about. And it is very much related to future vision. What's quite interesting about this, of course, is that what you can do with visualization, of course, is to shift your neural pathways, if you like. So let's say, the example that Christina and I is, let's say that you set sheep out on the side of a mountain, and eventually, by constantly going the same routes, they will form paths. Now, the more they use those routes, the stronger those paths become, such that they become full tracks, and then we all follow those tracks. Now, the neural pathways are a similar sort of concept, conceptually only, is that where you constantly travel down the same path, so you end up with a similar result constantly again and again. Now, you can, of course, if you work out how to, and visualization is one of those techniques sometimes used to do that, is you can change that neural pathway incrementally, gradually, and that's what we call plasticity, that I've spoken of quite a few times, of mental plasticity. And that then sort of segues a little bit into NLP, neuro-linguistic planning. So where you change the way you do certain things, or the way you speak about certain things, that gradually changes the way that your neural pathways change, which then gradually comes down to changing your behavior. And that's partly what all this is about, apart from creativity, apart from designing, apart from any sort of future vision. It is basically about finding new neural pathways and using them in a strategic way. So you use them in a specific way. So I'd like to go to the second stage of this of the exercise. So I'm going to have to ask you to close your eyes again. The reason that I'm asking you to close your eyes is so that you can just sort of visualize a little bit stronger. So once again, if you just close your eyes, and then take 2 or 3 deep breaths. That's 4 in, and then 4 out. And then just pause, and then 4 in, and then 4 out. So now, again, you've still got the paper napkin, and you can picture it, you can feel it, you can see it. It's the same napkin as before. It still has the decorative edge, which is slightly embossed. And you can feel all the same sensations as before, but you have it in your hands. So now what I'd like you to do is to just begin to turn it around and to unfold the paper napkin, so that the decorative edge is now facing towards you. but keep that napkin flat for the time being. So begin now to picture unfolding the napkin. So usually they're folded into 4 parts. So you separate them, first of all, like a book opening, and then a book opening again, and then you have the flattened out napkin. Okay, that's all you need to do at this moment. I'm pretty sure that all of you have got that. It's not complicated, it's not difficult, but what you've done is now you've actually manipulated something in 3 dimensions. So we're on to stage 2. You've stage 1 was basically just sort of seeing it, feeling it, touching it, smelling it. Stage 2 now is about manipulating. Now you're manipulating something that I hope you haven't actually got a napkin in your hand, but you're actually manipulating it. So you're 3-dimensionally moving something around, which is a very, very complex concept if you think about it, and actually very difficult to do, because one of the tests for intelligence, apparently, this is why designers are so intelligent, is one of the IQ tests is to be able to manipulate shapes and spaces without necessarily being able to physically move them. So you've just done that. So that proves that you can do stage 2. We'll go to stage 3 in a few minutes. I think we've got a few other things to talk about first. So, right, if you want to use this for goal setting, for changing mindsets, then you need to manage the process. And that's what we wanted to do, is to try to make this sort of as practical as it could possibly be. So I think that in order to do that, you need to get your environment right. And your environment doesn't just mean your physical environment, it also means your mental environment. So we'll start with sort of the inner mental environment. And the first thing I think is identifying, whenever you sort of want to change anything, particularly a mindset, you have to identify first what the limiting beliefs are. And a very, very easy, very good way to do that is that first of all, to identify it. And as we said with Carol Dweck, is that what you do is you give it a name, you give it a personality. And then once you pick up that personality, you can then sort of start to manipulate and to change it and to reverse it. And this is also part of that sort of visualization process. And to go back to the pathways as well, negative thoughts condition our thinking and quite often condition our neural pathways. So if you have a very strong negative thought, it will be a very strong pathway. And you will constantly be thinking the same thing again and again and again, and still getting the same sort of results. And yes, you're right, Barry, machine theory has very similar premise as well. So it's about sort of finding ways to gently shift your neural pathways so that you begin to break down the limiting beliefs that stop you, or that constantly stop you from doing something. And I mean, we've all got it. We all do it, and we all sort of procrastinate, or whatever the thing may be. That's something that we all do.
And just one more thing on that. I just wanted to add one more thing. You can also, and I use this tactic a lot, like you were saying, just obviously identifying it, but you can also witness but not attach to it. So just another way of looking at it. No judgment, it's there. I'm just going to let that go. I'm not going to attach to it. It's kind of like scrolling through social media instead of clicking on it, going to the website, buying the product. It's just scrolling past it and then maybe replacing it, like you said, with something more positive, but having that positive focus or that idea ready to replace it with.
Absolutely. And replacement is something that we spoke about also in changing habits.
Yeah.
If you want to change a habit, it's very difficult to do it by sheer willpower. What you do is you replace something, either the cue or the reward or the behavior. So one of those 3 within that sort of little cycle, you have to sort of, first of all, identify what it is, then you have to interrupt it, and then gradually it will change. But you need some persistence, and we'll come back to persistence in a minute. The other thing is, I think if you want to use visualization, and to be honest, it can be really good fun if you want to. It can also be devastating if you don't want it to be, is to block out time. You do need to allocate a bit of time. You don't need much time. And it's a really great, silly skill to have that is incredibly useful. And it's incredibly useful to be able to visualize something forward in the future. These are all the what if experiments. It's one of the fundamental sort of needs and premises of all creative thinking is what if, and asking the right questions. And of course, you need to eliminate negative thoughts. So, because the other thing is that, of course, desires which go into negative thoughts can lead to, and do lead to, procrastination, to laziness, to all sorts of things, because of failure as well. Because you're constantly doing the same thing, expecting a different result. The different result doesn't happen, so you feel that you failed. You then pile on your failure, so you're not using any deliberate practice, which is the other thing we spoke about analyzing it, looking at it, moving on by small incremental steps. I don't want to get too philosophical, but a little bit. Schopenhauer. This is a quote from Schopenhauer. Well, it's not a direct quote, obviously, because he's not English. But sorrows and mishaps are produced by two factors: pain and boredom. Now, I'm not sure I fully agree with boredom, but there is also this a very current theory at the moment about moving from, well, it's not so current, but moving from pain to pleasure. And that a lot of what we do is actually based around that desire and that need to move away from pain towards pleasure. Unless, of course, pain gives you pleasure, which is completely different, of course. So I think that the other thing the other corollary with that is the belief that external factors are influencing your behavior, when actually it's probably more to do with internal factors. And that brings me back to one of my sort of pet things, which is attitude and effort. The only two things you can control are your attitude and the amount of resources, the effort that you put into it. So if, traumas aside, of course, if you have sort of a difficult situation, it's more about how you handle it, how you deal with it, how you use it, and how you visualize your way out of it, than it is necessarily the actual external event itself. So it's how you deal with things when they go wrong that really sort of makes the difference, and that is all about your effort. And that will come to in a minute, because we'll talk a little bit about NLP and changing the language that you use. But what I think we're getting at here is that basically strong desires have strong outcomes. So good, pleasure; bad, pain, perhaps. If they're very strong, they will continuously force those outcomes, and they're very difficult to change. So you have to find small incremental ways to change it. Right, the next thing we wanted to talk about was the difference between meditation and visualization. So I think, and we were discussing it earlier, is that I think that visualization is is for a specific targeted process. And it's about sort of focus and a future vision. So normally you would use visualization in order to make an outcome happen, to change your future, or to anticipate your future. Whereas meditation, I think, is more about a more internal focus, in a sense, in that it's more about sort of settling your mind in the present rather than in the future. And I sort of think that that's where we've come to as a conclusion of what the difference is, that visualization is more for creativity and performance, whereas meditation is more for relaxation and quieting and stilling sort of all the unnecessary voices in your mind. Yep. Okay, you ready for stage 3?
Yep,
Okay.
Get into it. I was just going to say one more thing about the difference between meditation and visualization. The other thing that, when Charles and I were talking earlier about it, is that They are amazing for everybody to use separately for different things, but they can also, if you bring meditation and visualization into, and this is specifically with athletes, when they're actually going through that performance or that kind of end result, you almost get into that state of flow. So that's almost the state of flow is almost that meditation and visualization almost coming together, which I thought was pretty cool. But they are pretty different, even though we'll talk about next week.
I think they are
ideas.
I think where we're sort of headed with this is that you need all the parts.
Yeah.
To optimal performance in anything, it's not just one thing or the other. You need all the bits. Right, so we're going to do stage 3. This one is the maybe more fun one. We'll see. We'll see. So once again, you've got to gently close your eyes. Take 3 deep breaths. Sort of breathe in on 4, and then breathe out. And just hold. Breathe in and breathe out. And hold. Breathe in one more time. And breathe out. And just relax. And make sure your spine is straight as well, because it does make a difference. Right, I'd like you to go back to your unfolded napkin. And again, I'd like you to hold it, to picture it, to feel it, to smell it, to see it, to turn it over. This is the first time you've turned it over. I want you to turn it right over. And what I'd like you to do now is to notice that there is a spot of blood on the napkin. And then grasp the napkin and crush it and hold it up to your face. Okay. So we'll stop there. So what I hope happened for you is that there's a little story now. So what you've done is that stage 1 is just basically sort of using your senses and using your inner eye. Stage 2 is then sort of where we begin to manipulate the space. And stage 3 is now that we build the story on the basis of that. And this can be incredibly powerful, very easy to do, very easy to practice, and something you can do very, very, very often. But manipulating things in your mind and then creating a story from it. The reason I said blood, for instance, is because it's quite emotive. I mean, I don't know what your stories out there are with the blood. I mean, you can make it up however you want. That depends on your mindset. I won't go into that. But it has some meaning and it has some emotion. So the last part we've really put in is that little bit of emotion and a little event as well. So I don't know what the event is, but I'd be very surprised if you didn't have any sort of story that, you know, why. And that's part of it as well, is then beginning to ask questions. What we've done is we've now sort of suggested a whole story. Now, you can use this technique basically to visualize a space, to visualize a place, to visualize God. One of the key factors that designers particularly use, and I remember this from the days when I worked for a guy called Bob Lush at a company called Richmond International, is that he always says that if you're designing a restaurant, you have to sit in every single seat. Now, he didn't mean that when it's constructed, you go and sit in every single seat. What he meant is that you must mentally sit in every single seat and see if you like the view, if it's comfortable, if you're being served correctly, because all of those factors come in. And that's basically how designers use, or particularly sort of architects and designers use visualization, is that we will manipulate an object or a space within our minds. Now, the example for this, I think, which I'll probably talk about a bit more later, is I can't read music. If I look at a sheet of music, it's dots on sort of parallel bars and that's it. It doesn't mean anything to me. To a musician, they can see the melody, the tune, the cadence, the sound. They can see the whole piece of music. Similarly, for designers, particularly architects and interior designers, is that the thing that we see when we look at a plan is we see the whole space, or we should do, I should say. I don't know about all designers, but you can interpret, you can understand exactly what it means, and what it means not just as a space and not just as a style of a space, but to be in the space. And that's the skill that we sort of intuitively develop. We don't necessarily get to it just because we sort of got a gift, but we sort of learn to develop it because you look at the space again and again. This comes back to deliberate practice as well. And so I think that that really one of the things about visualization, again, is back to this thing of it's a vision of the future, if you like. It is our what if mentality. It's how we try things out. It's how we test things. The stronger and the more powerfully we can try and test things, the clearer they become. And then we're going to gradually sort of start coming towards how we set goals with visualization. And I think it's also that we fear things and anticipate things because we can visualize what happens. So if we didn't have any method of visualizing the future, then there would be no reason to fear anything or to enjoy anything, because you might enjoy it only in the moment, or fear it in the moment, but you wouldn't fear it, you would feel it. So my point is that visualization is how we visualize the future. And that's why I say everybody does it. You just have to work out how to embrace it, and then how to manipulate it, and then how to use it. And you've all done it very, very simply this evening. And it's the sort of thing that you can do again and again and again. And the next thing that we wanted to mention was this thing about sort of using outside sort of elements to help you to visualize. Now, we talked about vision boards and whether they work, whether they help. And honestly, I think they do. And, you know, some marketing gurus will tell you, write your goal on a card, and then you have to visualize it or look at it every day. And the more that gets imprinted on your mind, the more likely you are to achieve your goal. And I saw flashed up on the screen, probably from Jonathan, I didn't quite see who it was, talking about Arthur Ashe. And I will never forget the Wimbledon tournament that he won, where he, in between each of the sets of games, he would sit down. He was completely and utterly calm. Now, what I assume he was doing was two things. One was just being very still, very calm, and focusing just on the moment. But I bet you he was also visualizing how his game strategy was going to work, and was just very, very focused. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Christina, that is one of the biggest things that I keep hearing in sport is, you know, what is your game? In fact, worse than sports, you get it on reality TV. What is your strategy? You know, how are you going to deal with all of this? So that's all about sort of visualizing a future and working with it. So I think vision boards do work. I think they're a very, very good method of encouraging you to participate. But I think they only work if you invest yourself into them, if you invest in the emotions, if you invest in the sensations, if you invest in the belief, basically.
And then the other thing that we were talking about with that, Charles, and the reason that I feel like sometimes this, you know, when you visualize things, they get closer or they're more apparent. Like we were talking about the red car. It's like if you didn't want a red car, then you probably wouldn't notice a bunch of red cars out there, or, you know, or if you have a goal and then all of a sudden, like things, you know, if you didn't have that goal in mind, things that could pop up relating to your goal, you wouldn't even see them. So by visualizing or by noticing something or having something in your field that can help you get closer to the result that you want, by making you more aware of your surroundings and aware of what you want and how to get there.
I'm not much of a Bible quoter, but I will quote the Bible, which does say, "Seek and you shall find." What I think it means is not if you keep looking, you'll find it. I think it means that the more you look for something, the more you see something.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's true of everything. As you're growing up, you suddenly become. I remember watching a film called Swiss Family Robinson when I was a kid, and there was a word that came up in it that I'd never heard before, and it was career. I had no idea what career was. The minute after I heard that, or not the minute, but soon after I heard that word, it seemed to be everywhere. And I couldn't understand, why didn't I notice this word ever before? And I didn't even know what it meant. So it was even more stupid. So now we're sort of getting towards, basically, I think it is worth writing your goals down. And I think they do have to be a long way in the future. But I think it's also necessary to visualize it and then to work backwards from that, because otherwise you're not committed to it, to work backwards from that and break it down into small steps. And we'll come to exactly how we do that in a moment. So what we have now is just some of the basic parameters of mucking around with visualization, because there is a fourth stage to this, which I'm not going to do today, which is to do all the manipulation, all the emotional involvement with your eyes open. And if you ever watch designers when they're at the very early stage of conceiving something, that's exactly what they're doing. They may be doing it partially on paper, but they're playing in their minds, scribbling and changing and scribbling and changing, and it's an iterative process that we'll also talk about a little bit later. So the how-to, very, very simple. Close your eyes. You don't have to do it right now. Find a quiet place, but the key thing is to close off distractions. And I think this is true of meditation as well. You must sort of switch off and close off all distractions. You need to allow your thoughts to flow. I mean, nobody is censoring you. You can do what you like, and you gradually build your story. Now, this goes back to, I don't know where it comes from, but there's this thing about finding your happy place. And you might identify somewhere like, be it a beach, or be it a church, or be it a forest, or whatever, or a mountain. You find that, but then you gradually build and build and build all the sensations that go with that space or that place. And it is about, I think, playing with it, having fun. Kids do it all the time. There's some kids next door to me here, and they're always screaming, partly because they're setting the rules for the games that they play, which change instantly and constantly. But most of the time, they're basically just building stories all the time, just building and having fun with it and changing this. And when they don't get what they want, that's when they scream and shout. But anyway, I think it is about allowing yourself to build these stories in any direction that you want, because it's your imagination, it's nobody else's. Just be careful that you don't sort of slip into sort of hallucinations and all the rest, because that's not so good. I always try to think that it's a bit like an air balloon, a hot air balloon, is that it's not quite the right analogy, but it's nearly the right thing. You do need at some point some sort of cord or string or rope to hold it to the ground so that it is slightly grounded. It does need to be, visualization, I think, is grounded in reality, because it's grounded also in a future vision, but it needs to be grounded in reality. So you can float, but you need to be sort of anchored to the earth, I think. And then we're on to sort of how-to part 2, which is what you need to add into the mix. Because what's really interesting, and what's been proven over and over and over again, is that the brain really doesn't know the difference between imagination and reality. It fires up in virtually, not totally, but virtually the same way. The theory is that this is to do with something called mirror neurons, which means that, for instance, or it's connected to mirror neurons, I should say, which is this concept that if you see, for instance, a child catch their finger in the door, you sort of wince and scream with that sort of pain. Now, you're not feeling the pain, but your brain is firing up in the same way. So because the brain doesn't know the difference, that's why I think you can sort of use that skill to carve better new neural pathways, which is where we sort of started on this. But your visualizations must be vivid. I think they must be absolutely deliberate, and we'll come to intentionality a bit later. Visualizations need to be goal focused. I know some meditation is goal focused as well, and also involves images, but visualization is very focused on goals. They must be specific and exact as well. And the more specific, the more sort of sensual that they are, the better that they will be. And the better you'll be able to use them and work with them as well. And it must, one thing we've forgotten to mention, and I'm just coming to sort of feelings and emotions, is that you must imbue your visualizations with feelings and emotions, otherwise they're meaningless. And what has also been proven is that with feeling and emotion and with vivid visualizations, it's much better for memory as well. So if you can visualize a space and you can visualize how you feel within that space, then you're more likely to be able to remember it if you need to recall it. And you have to use all your senses. It's not just a case of seeing a picture. So visualization is a slight misnomer because it's not actually about images. It's this sort of thing called maybe mentalese or whatever your brain does, that language that your brain uses, that's what you have to use. But that includes all the sensory inputs, and all that information that comes in, you need to use, and you need to use it to manipulate the situation.
And along those lines, I think it's just interesting. Charles and I were talking about this before, and just to mention, so all of those things, it's extremely powerful to get you in the zone to have a positive, like we were talking about, getting rid of the negative emotions, having a really positive experience towards your positive emotions. And so if you have all of these tactics, it's a lot easier not to lose yourself on that negative pathway. Because with the negative pathway, you would do just the opposite, which is if you do have a negative thought, you can make it, just single dimensional, and you can make it black and white, and you can shrink it, and you can make it smaller. Whereas what Charles is talking about with all these things, we're embodying emotion, we're making things vivid, we're making them almost tangible that you can feel and see and hear and everything. You can do the opposite with reducing your, the ideas that you want to get rid of.
Well, one of the things that NLP uses is that it will ask you to visualize the problem that you have, or whatever it is you want to change, to package it, to then sort of gently sort of remove it or to displace it, but to acknowledge that it's there. So, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, that is one of the key fundamental sort of techniques for neurolinguistic planning, is to actually sort of package things and to say, oh, look, here's that terrible thought. Hang on, let me just put this to one side. They use it particularly with phobias as well, is that you have to acknowledge them first and then gradually overcome them, I think. I don't know enough about that. It's something I'd have to do a bit of research on. The other thing is belief. We've got to sort of chuck in a bit of belief, because if you don't believe in your visualizations, now, I know what you have to believe in them in order to make them real, but the truth is, that they're not real. So let's not get sort of too hung up on that, but you do need belief, because if you don't believe in their strength and the vividness of the visualization that you're doing, then chances are you will just let it slide away. So that's more related to goal setting as well, I think. Affirmations as well. And you have to, as I said, with designers, you have to play the role. You have to be in it. You have to, and I think, well, no, that's not different from meditation, but I think one of the key things with visualization is that you have to be an active part within it. And that's why when I took you through those 3 exercises, it isn't just about picturing something, it's about sort of being right in it with mental ease, or whatever the language you want to call it, which involves all your senses, all your emotions, everything you see, everything that you interpret as well, maybe conceptual too. And I think there is a very good, strong argument for saying that that scientists, for instance, or mathematicians who conceive various very complex ideas are doing it by a method of visualization. Einstein being the very straightforward example is that in order to, apart from the fact that he had phenomenal mathematics, in order to be able to visualize his theories, he actually sort of made mental pictures. One of them was riding on a train at the speed of light, or nearly at the speed of light, I should say. The other was being in a lift car and falling to the ground. What happens if you just jump the moment before it crashes? Do you avoid death? Anyway, that's it. Language. Let's just go just a little bit and talk about affirmations and language, because I think one of the big key things is that you have to change your language, and you have to sort of use affirmations. And I think that's actually a very powerful thing. Build your confidence as well. Push beyond your comfort zone. We've said this so many times, from deliberate practice, from all these things. With flow as well, you have to push a little bit beyond your comfort zone. You have to go to the next step. And repetition works incredibly well. You must practice, basically. You must practice, but you must practice in the right way. I think that visualization needs to think big, always, and way beyond sort of anything practical. I think, Christine, you didn't quite agree with me on that one, but that's okay. That's where I feel.
I think it's not that I didn't agree with you, but I do think that when we were talking about something different, it's like you can't have big dreams, but you know, almost like the one big thing, you're going to have to break it down.
You do have to. Yeah, I agree.
So not necessarily that you're not to dream extravagant or big or anything like that.
Yeah. And if we're sort of lurching now towards goal setting, then the big thing is that you have to think in the present moment. Now, again, that sounds like a sort of, it sounds like I've split the two things, but the truth is you have to be in the moment, but it is talking about the future. So it's a little bit complex, that. I'm not quite sure how to explain it, but you must see things in the first person. You must see it from your point of view. That's basically where you must be. So here's, I'll give you just a very quick little exercise you could do for 2 minutes every day, or 5 minutes, or 30 seconds, it doesn't matter. Is just a simple way to sort of train your visualization is by working with your memory and with your sensations. So if you find just a picture in a magazine or any picture you like, actually it doesn't have to be one you like, but preferably one you like, just look at it for 30 seconds, put it away, recall, practice. Then bring it back up again, try again, and then gradually sort of start working into to manipulating it into the recall of it into 3 dimensions. Then sort of imagine yourself in the place, in the space, and work with that. So gradually build up to those things. And then the final thing is then to place yourself into the whole scenario, be it an exotic place or wherever it may be, and then to use your senses to use sort of vivid feelings and emotions and affirmations. The examples, right, we've got a few examples of this. My favorite actually is Roger Bannister, who prior to Roger Bannister running the 4-minute mile, everyone believed that it was not humanly possible to do it. He became convinced that it might be possible and completely and utterly changed his mindset and visualized himself doing it. Now, the same goes, I think, for Michael Phelps as well, who visualized himself actually doing it. I've seen Tiger Woods sort of, you know, before a shot or before a putt, you can almost see the path that he's looking at for the golf ball to get into the hole. and chess masters, of course, are the masters of that sort of visualization and holding all those things in their mind at the same time. It's about patterns as well, about forming patterns. Good. So the brain. Well, how are we doing? I better speed up a bit, but I'm going fine. Right. So as I said, the brain fires up basically the same areas in a very similar way with imagination and with reality. It creates neural pathways. You can create neural pathways in your imagination first. And probably, I mean, I have no proof for this, but probably that's what children do first. They rehearse, they play, and then that becomes how they behave. So that strikes me, and sheep on the pathways is exactly the same thing, is that, you know, eventually they will forge a path or a track that they will constantly sort of follow. And back to sort of changing habits, back to deliberate practice, it's all about small steps and planning the small steps first and getting things into your subconscious. I read somewhere that someone said it was 66 days to change a habit. Someone else said 99 days. And someone else said 10,000, oh, that was Malcolm Gladwell said 10,000 hours. Well, none of those are right, and it'll vary for everybody. But the principle is that you need to repeat, but it needs to be small steps. Now, don't be daunted by the fact that it seems to be a very long time. But you do need to start small, and it does need to get into your subconscious mind so it becomes an automatic thing. And that's why constant affirmations do work, like little goal cards or mood boards or visual boards, I think really do work. And then we come to fake it till you make it, or make it till you make it. I'm a massive believer in this. I mean, we were talking earlier about imposter syndrome, and I think I spent all of my professional life thinking, I really shouldn't be here. I really shouldn't be. I'm really not qualified to do this. I shouldn't be talking about this because I know nothing about it. But I do think that there is something fundamentally right in actually sort of faking it or making it or doing it in the belief that you can do it. And then eventually you will do it. And I think that the phrase that I come up with is that you use your mind to change your mind, basically. So I do think that it does work, and that brings us to NLP, neuro-linguistic planning, which is all about convincing yourself that you can do something by little incremental steps. And they're very, very clever, I think, in the way that they package things up and then ask you to visually move them aside or pass over them. So that, I think, makes absolute sense to me, and that's how you gradually move forward, is by identifying things, moving them aside, and then sort of forging your way through it. If only it were that easy to do it in real life, but it ain't, I'm afraid. That's the reality of it.
And I think this is what we talk about in basically all of the talks that we've had, is that it's really simple, it's just not easy. But you can use habits in order to create the neural pathway that makes it easier and easier. And I think it's really interesting. I think the one book that we just discussed, the one thing, you know, when they came up with those 66 days, the actual study said, well, it's actually between 3 and 237 days. Like people, it's a huge range. So, so depending on how hard the habit is for you, it could only take a few days, or it could take, you know, hundreds of days. So I think that's very interesting. So with everything that we're talking about, and then going back to the mind mapping, the one big thing, the easier and easier it is if you have that big goal, you have that desire, and you are present with it, and you break it down.
Yeah, and you have the small steps, smaller goals, achievable steps should get you to your destination better. And you need to reward yourself as well. Each small little sort of achievement needs to be rewarded. There's a nice sort of little thing which is an acronym called SMART, which is that your goals should be specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. So that sort of sums it up. Obviously, the first part specific is what we've been talking about, is this whole thing of visualizing the goal. The measurability and all that is the stuff that comes afterwards. And achievable, I must say, I don't quite agree with that. I don't know, if you've achieved your goal, then what are you going to do next? You've got to think of another goal. So you might as well have a really big goal and just break it down into lots of steps. It just seems strange to me. Time bound does make sense to me, because you have to break things down. You have to chunk time, and you have to allocate time to do things. And this can be sort of pretty much applied to everything. I mean, I think visualization can be applied to everything. You can picture the ideal relationship that you want, and you can encourage yourself, let's say, to achieve that kind of relationship. Now, it may not work out because there's someone else involved, of course, which always makes life a bit difficult. So that's the mind map that we had with the one thing. That's, you can apply it to any pillar, be it financial, be it a career, be it relationships or spiritual, or whatever it might be. I want to talk about failure a little bit, because that's the difficult bit, I think, is that inevitably, and I'm sure everyone's done it, you set yourself a goal, say, I'm going to do this, this, and this, and then it doesn't quite work. And I think that that's really where sort of grit comes in, and perseverance, and tenacity as well, is that you do have to have belief and decide that you want to do it. But you should never, I don't think, again, I stand corrected by anybody who wants to, but I don't think you should ever change the goal. And that's why I think the goal needs to be very long reaching and very ambitious. Because what you need to do is you just need to change the strategy. Why would you want to sort of end up going somewhere else every time? Because you'd end up like me and say, oh, that didn't work, I'll do something else. Oh, no, that one didn't work. No, let me try this one. That software didn't do what I thought it was going to do, so let me try another one. So I think you need to sort of set the goal. And this comes to that other thing about, we were talking earlier about, let's say you say, oh, well, I want a Bentley, or a Ferrari, whatever it is. I think you have to drill down on that sort of stuff and say, okay, why? And there's this technique as well of asking 5 times why and drilling down. So eventually you'll always come down to either status or happiness or joy or something like that. So, but it is worth drilling down, because on the route to drilling down, you will work out what things are not so important. And it might be that the actual possession, in fact, that all comes into branding, which I'm fascinated by, is that why we buy into certain types of stories when in fact that's not really what we want. You don't buy a drill because you want a drill, you buy a drill because you want a hole, or you want to solve a problem. So I think that's where that all comes down to. And failure just has to be reset. You have to have courage. It has to be deliberate practice. And I think it is quite intimidating sometimes. And that's about the growth mindset, is surely the best thing to do, which I know is ridiculously difficult. I'm not sort of putting myself forward as any paragon of virtue, is that you have to have a growth mindset in order to learn from failure. And failure is not an easy thing and not a pleasant thing, I think. And that interrupts what we want to do. And we tend to sort of revert back to our zone of comfort, to our regular neural pathways, which are not always the best things that we want to get to our goal. What is the one thing I can do today that makes everything else easier or unnecessary?
And the other thing along with failure, I think we just talked about with the growth mindset, is that the stronger the pathway for your positive thinking, the easier it is to take failure with a growth mindset and reframe, reshape, pivot, go for your a different strategy. So all the things, all the tools that Charles has talked about earlier can help us with this idea of, oh wait, this is just a roadblock that we need to kind of figure something else out around, instead of taking it personally and going down that negative aspect.
The phrase I've come up with for that is that your goals are only as strong as your belief in their achievement. So even though they may be very far reaching. You have to believe that you can get there, because if you don't believe you can get there, then why even bother to try? So you do have to invest belief into it, and you do have to sort of shut down negative talk, or package it up and put it aside and then move on. So yeah, and yeah, squashing the inner critic is the big thing, and I think that is incredibly difficult. It's not just something you can just sort of say, oh well, I'll just sort of squash all that language that's going on in my head, or the way that I behave on certain things. The other thing that comes back from the one thing is this thing of don't be a victim. Take responsibility, or accountability, he calls it, for your actions. You know, if you are going to go for a goal, if you are going to set a goal and you're going to visualize what that could be, take accountability, take responsibility for it, and take every single little step. And again, the same sort of wonderful phrase is, what is the one thing I can do today that moves me closer? I say closer to my goal, but it's that makes all things easier, or other things unnecessary. So I think that is the right route to do it. But visualization is a very, very good, strong, powerful tool, I think, for setting goals or setting lifestyles that you want to achieve. But difficult, simple to talk about, very simple for us to talk about, but very difficult to actually do. And I think also that visualization, which we haven't spoken about probably enough tonight, because there's a lot to talk about on it, is about performance as well. And it really is a big buzzword in sports nowadays, and in any sort of elite profession, is this whole thing of visualizing it. The same with musicians as well, and particularly sports people, elite athletes, I think. So that's about what I have for you today on visualization. I would encourage you to all to muck about and just play with visualizing things and manipulating things in your mind. It's really good fun. I mean, that's why a lot of us do sort of stupid puzzles as well, where you have to sort of, does this shape, or Tetris is the example, does that shape turn round and fit into that particular space? So to explain the example is that of design and music is my sort of metaphor for visualization, is that some people can see something, and with practice they know what music says. I don't, unfortunately, but I can look at a plan and I do know what it feels like to be in that space. And it's an iterative process. You have to keep repeating. The last thing I just wanted to mention was this. There is, it's probably on YouTube, I don't know, there's this wonderful video or film of Picasso painting on a sheet of glass. And he's painting and painting and building this spectacular painting. And then all of a sudden he says, no. I think he says in French, ça va très mal. So he says it's going very badly. And we think, oh, no, this is, it looks wonderful. And he changes everything. So what I think separates people like Picasso from many other sort of us normal, ordinary people is his ability to completely rethink where he's going and to reinvent. I mean, Picasso is the best example of an artist who throughout his life reinvented himself and had no fear of doing that. I think he had no fear because he got so used to doing it that was his strategy. So it is continuous evolution. So that's it. Less push, more flow, I think was your final comment, wasn't it?
Yes, exactly. So hopefully you guys have some good ideas on, one, the creative process and the tips that Charles gave you to close your eyes and start to visualize things and move them around. And then also maybe thinking about that one big thing, that task in the future, that idea in the future, and then breaking it down into little steps. And then even visualizing how those little steps would play out and getting really familiar with the emotions. I think that's a very, very important point as well.
I think also with visualization and using it, it is an incredibly useful tool in everything. But just start easy. Do little steps. 2 or 3, 4, 5 minutes a day is max. It's all you need just to get your mind working in that way. Just relax, take it easy. One thing we didn't really talk about, 2 seconds, and we'll just talk about it, is intentionality. Is that it's all about intent and agency. I think that's why I say visualization is far more practical, far more physical than, say, meditation. Climbing is the big example of that. When you go climbing, you normally will look at the route you're going to take. You should see all your moves before you do it. If you don't believe me, watch Free Solo and you'll see Alex Honnold just going through even just the nuance of, right, at this point I turn this thumb over that way and this one that way, and then that finger goes, and he visualized every single move that he was going to make up climbing El Capitan. And you need focus, it needs to be effortless as well, so that takes practice. And it sounds like the wrong way around, but the more focused and the more you practice, the more effortless and the easier it becomes, and the more flow you get into. And that flow, if you remember from that talk, is where your skill is high and your comfort zone is relatively high, but both are challenged. And at that point, when it comes together, that's flow, basically. And I think that's probably enough for today.
Yes, that's good. So next week, we will talk about mindfulness. We'll talk about some ideas for starting your meditation practice, the benefits of the meditation practice, and also some apps that we both use that could be beneficial. But until then, I invite you, obviously, just use these visualization skills and maybe doing 5 minutes a day until we talk to you next week.
That'd be great. I'll test you all next week.
Yeah. And he will.
Yeah. Be well, everybody.
Thank you so much, everybody.
See you. Bye.